Shalom, bruchim habayim. We are now introducing a new series on Sefer Vayikra, and in this series we'll be highlighting and learning from the commentary of Harav Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, or Abarbanel. Apparently Abarbanel is more correct. Abarbanel, statesman, philosopher, scholar, rabbi, financier to kings, and leader of his people during the tragic and difficult times of the expulsion from Spain in 1492. And for our purposes, the author of an important and extensive commentary on most of the Tanakh. We'll get right into what Abarbanel has to say on Sefer Vayikra, but first a word of introduction. The approach of Abarbanel is comprehensive in the sense that his aim is to explicate the whole topic, the whole area that he's dealing with. He does go verse by verse, but his aim is to explain things in all their dimensions. The whole subject, the whole topic at hand, in all its various dimensions. And in this sense, nothing is more natural for him than to write an introduction to Sefer Vayikra, which is basically an overview of all the korbanot, of all these sacrifices. We'll be taking an overview of this overview. We don't have time, obviously, not to go into everything here. But after having this basic survey of his overview, we'll focus in on one of the aspects of his introduction to Sefer Vayikra. Abarbanel is not the first to write an overview of the sacrifices. He was preceded primarily by the Rambam. The Rambam, in his commentary to the Mishnah and Seder Kodashim, wrote the first, I think, summary of the world of korbanot. He puts everything into order, and when he begins his overview of korbanot, he says, "Raiti להגדיל דברים בחילוקי הקורבנות וסקירת סוגיהם." Whereas the Rambam describes his approach, which will be sugim, chilukim. He's going to categorize all the korbanot in their various subjects, in the various categories and classes, and in that way, the whole topic of korbanot, which is described at length and in detail in Sefer Vayikra, will become more clear. Basically, the Rambam uses two types of classification. One is the classifications of the types of korbanot. There are four types: Olah, Chatat, Asham, and Shlamim. And the Rambam says that every korban that exists falls into one of these categories and is a variation of one of them. His second classification is korbanot yachid, korbanot tzibur, korbanot that are brought by the individual person, and korbanot that are brought by the Am Yisrael as a whole. Now, Abarbanel, who comes here in the wake of the Rambam, he has his own description of the world of korbanot, and he divides his introduction into four categories. He says he's going to discuss chomer, tzura, poel, and tachlit. Right? This is a philosophical terminology. Chomer, tzura, or matter, form. Poel, the agent, the doer, the one who brings the korban. And tachlit, the purpose of the korban. To put it briefly, by chomer he means the animals from which we bring the korban, whether it be a sheep or an ox or a goat, etc. As far as the tzura, the form, I would translate it here as the configuration of the korban. The configuration meaning what's the final disposition of the animal, what's done with it in the end. Is it totally burned on the mizbeach like an olah? Is it partially burned and partially eaten by the Kohanim? Is it partly burned, partly eaten by the Kohanim, and partly eaten by the person who brought the korban? all these are various configurations of the ultimate disposition of the korban, and this is another way of dividing the korbanot into the various types. The third category is the po'el, right? The person who brings the korban, and this is simply an exposition of the reason why the person brings it, or what occasions he's bringing it. Is he bringing it voluntarily? Is he obligated to bring it by the halacha? And then the Abarbanel goes into the various things that might obligate a person to bring a korban. And the final category is the tachlit, the purpose. Now, the part of this overview which I'd like to focus on is the last one, the tachlit. This is an issue which the Rambam, in his introduction to Seder Kodashim, does not address at all. However, it did spark a lively discussion among the Rishonim in the wake of something that the Rambam wrote in a different place, not in his commentary to the Mishnah, but in the Moreh Nevuchim. In the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam gives rationales for the various mitzvot, and when it comes to korbanot, he gives a theory which caused a great amount of commotion among the Rishonim who came after him. The Rambam says there basically that the reason that the Torah commanded korbanot was what he calls a kavanah shniyah, a secondary purpose, a secondary intention of the Torah, as opposed to a primary intention. In other words, the Torah had to legislate korbanot because of the situation that existed. The situation was that Bnei Israel lived in a world in which people worshipped idols, and part of the rite of idol worship was sacrifices. And that's what they were used to. Now, Hashem certainly wanted Am Yisrael to engage in the things which are service to Him, which are avodat Hashem. But he wasn't interested in doing it the way that the idol worshippers did it, which is in the form of korbanot. He was interested more in tefillah and in the Talmud Torah and in the kiyum of the observance of all the other mitzvot. But sacrifices was something which the Torah legislated because Hashem saw that He could not do away with it. The Rambam says it would be equivalent to us if, let's say, somebody would say, I want you to serve God without tefillah, without praying. That's something which is not tenable, because that's our whole part of our whole outlook of how to worship Hashem is through prayer. And therefore, there was no choice but to legislate the korbanot, to legislate the sacrifices. And this is, as the Rambam points out, says again, this is a kavanah shniyah, a secondary intention. We might call it either also b'diavad intention, in other words, a sign of after the fact. It would have been preferable to serve Hashem other ways, but this was necessary in order to get people away from avodah zarah. And therefore, the Rambam says, when the Torah did institute sacrifices, it limited it only in the Beit HaMikdash and only in certain times. It's not something you can do anywhere, because the point was to get people away from the ways of avodah zarah. Ramban attacked this vehemently, and he said that this is perhaps I think Ramban probably objected to the whole idea of a kavanah rishonah and kavanah shniyah, to say that there are some mitzvot which really exemplify what the Torah wanted to do primarily, and other mitzvot which the Torah had to do because there was no choice. To say that there are some mitzvot which are more primary and the mitzvot which are less primary, that's something which in and of itself goes against the grain of a traditional thinking Jew. All these things are Ratzon Hashem. That's all what Hashem wants. Now, Abarbanel, who comes after this discussion of the Rambam and the Ramban, he claims that there is a lot to be said for the approach of the Rambam. You can find a lot of support for it in Chazal, in the words of Chazal, in the Midrashim, and in the Gemara. And to give an example, the Abarbanel brings psukim from which appear in the Nevi'im, which we know, where the Rabbi said, "Lamali rovasiv chaychem, ha'chevetz Hashem balotu zvachim." That comes in Sefer Shmuel, and he says that there are also Ma'amarei Chazal, which also express the same viewpoint, that the main thing is not korbanot, the main thing is to believe in Hashem, to do his other mitzvot. And Abarbanel claims that Ramban ignored all these proofs. But then Abarbanel also brings another approach to justify the Rambam. He says, "V'nini modiacha svarat hara v'da'ato b'davar hazeh. V'amro sheyu korbanot al kavana shenit, v'lo amar shelo yu al kavana rishona." If you precisely read the Rambam, you'll see he doesn't say that there's no kavana rishona in the korbanot. He says there's a kavana shenya, but he doesn't say there's no kavana rishona. So I'll tell you what he means. Abarbanel says, "Yesh shtei kavanot b'korbanot, kavana rishona v'kavana shenya. V'nei kavana rishona bo kedei litkarev adam le'elohav, likana lefanav, v'yamin b'tziyuto." In other words, the purpose of the korbanot is to draw near to Hashem, to believe in Him, and to subjugate yourself to Him. That's the purpose of the korbanot. However, the Rambam thinks that these aims could have been achieved more effectively other ways. And the reason that the Torah legislated dafka this approach was because of the fact that the people were used to it already, and there was no choice, there was no chance of getting them away from it. Okay, this is something which Abarbanel does, which is a bit of audacity, to read into the Rambam something which he really doesn't say. If you read that chapter in Rein V'Chim, it's really difficult to read this into the Rambam, that he does think that the korbanot have a kavana rishona. But nevertheless, this is another way of the Abarbanel kind of justifying the approach of the Rambam. And I would say parenthetically that this is something which is characteristic of the later generations of the Sephardic Rishonim who came after the Ramban. In other words, there was a movement to kind of justify the Rambam against the attacks of the Ramban. The Ramban was very critical of the Rambam when he put forward viewpoints which were philosophical and rationalistic in nature, and kind of gnawed away at the more traditional and the more faith-oriented approach, which was accepted in the European world. But after the Ramban, there were other sages who came from Sfarad who just wanted to justify the Rambam and show that really his approach is tenable and can be proven. And here the Abarbanel goes to the extent of saying, "I'll tell you what he meant. I'll reinterpret him." But in the end, Abarbanel does himself give a different explanation for the korbanot. This is for a different reason. It's something which the Rambam himself alludes to there in Moreh Nevuchim. He says, the Rambam writes as follows: He speaks to the reader. I know that you're going to run away from what I'm trying to say to you. He knows your heart will wonder, how is it possible? Excuse me. There are so many particular details of halachot in korbanot. It's a whole edifice of halacha. How is it possible that this whole thing is simply devised as a way of getting people away from doing something else? It doesn't make sense. Now, the Rambam really doesn't address this complaint directly. He says, I know that this is going to bother you, but the truth is the Rambam is not concerned so much with the details of halakha when he's explaining the rationale for mitzvot. You must keep the details of the halakha, But as far as understanding, you only have to understand the principle behind the mitzvah itself, the main mitzvah, and all the details are something which you can't explain. Abarbanel, in his exegesis of the Torah, doesn't think this at all. He's sure that the details of the Torah are meaningful, and in order to understand what the Torah wants, you have to go also into the details. So he asks, look, what I said before, there's different configurations of the korbanot. There are korbanot that are burned altogether, korbanot that are burned and partially eaten. There are korbanot that are eaten by the kohanim and by the owner. It's not tenable, it's not possible that all these things are simply devised as a way of getting people away from doing something else. These must have intrinsic meaning, intrinsic purpose. And that's why Abarbanel ends up thinking not like the Rambam, but not for the traditional reasons that the Ramban gave, that it's not, how can you say such a thing? He just says that the Rambam's approach doesn't explain everything. It doesn't work to explain all the apparatus of the korbanot. So Abarbanel says, right, in general, he says, if you take the korban olah, for example, which is totally burned on the mizbeach, the korban olah is something which Chazal identifies as something associated with the person's thought process. A person who sinned in his thoughts, he brings a korban olah. What does this mean? It means that the korban relates to the mental and the spiritual side of the person. And just like the animal unites with the flame on the mizbeach and goes up to heaven, this reminds the person who brings the korban of the fact that eventually his soul will also go up to heaven. And this is something which can inspire us even now to identify and unite with the fire on the Mizbeach, with the idea that we're supposed to be totally devoted to worship Hashem and be totally in unison and in sync with the things which the Torah wants. And this should be our main desire. And this is the purpose of the korban olah, to deepen our faith, to deepen our identification, and our commitment to keeping the Torah and the mitzvot. That's the purpose of the korban olah. Korbanot, which are brought on, which are partially eaten by the kohanim, such as the chatat and the asham, which are sin offerings. Abarbanel says that the sin offerings are basically penalties. A person who, even though he did the sin by accident, not intentionally, but still it needs atonement. And the penalty here is to pay for a korban and bring it on the mizbeach. And the eating of the korbanot implies that the kohanim are involved, and they will also pray for the atonement of this person. That's the point of the sin offerings. And the korban shlamim, in brief, he says, this is, we have two types. We have a korban todah, which is meant to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the things which he has done for us, and the regular korban shlamim, which is a form of prayer. The person prays for Hashem's bounty in the future. So it turns out that the Abarbanel, on the one hand, is, we could say, open-minded on this issue. Notice he does say that the Rambam's approach is possible, and there's nothing chas v'shalom heretical about it, and something which is totally tenable and fits in with something which we find in Chazal and in the Tanakh. And on the other hand, he thinks, but it's not sufficient, because it's only an explanation for the basic idea of korbanot. But if you want to really understand what's going on, you have to get into the details. So what we have seen here as far as the approach of Abarbanel is, first of all, his holistic approach to the topics in the Torah. We tasted this, and we'll see more of this in the future. And on the other hand, we also see his idea that the holistic approach implies also understanding all of the details of the Torah, what their place is in the scheme of things. So B'ezrat Hashem, in the future segments, we'll also pay attention to these various aspects of Abarbanel's approach, as well as others.